On the edge of the party sat an ordinary man. He had brown hair and hazel eyes, but nothing that made him stand out from the crowd. He was dressed in a three-piece suit and just sat quietly on the edge of the event, scanning his tablet. The party was a joint dinner dance at the wedding rehearsal, and one couple was Gary Harris and Belinda Cummings. Gary was about 6 feet 1 inch tall, 200 pounds, had wavy blonde hair, blue eyes, and a smile. Belinda was somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 feet 8 inches tall, short, curly brown hair. She had deep gray eyes and a prominent figure. Her cup size was at least 36C, but could approach 38C. The other couple was Jason Witten and Melissa Foster. Jason was under 6 feet tall. He always joked that his life ambition was to be 6 feet tall. His dark brown hair was a little long and gave him a gruff look. His eyes seemed to change color from dark brown to black depending on the lighting. Melissa was only 5 feet 5 inches tall, and her long blonde hair reached halfway down her back. Although her breasts were smaller than Belinda's, her body proportions were perfect. Both women were beautiful and both men were very attractive. Everyone agreed that they were the perfect couple. Gary and Jason had been friends since the first day of elementary school. In contrast, Belinda and Melissa had only been friends since their junior year of college. Although their friendship was relatively short-lived, both girls were very fond of each other. Gary strutted around the room, chatting with the guests. Most of them he knew, but some were guests or relatives he didn't know, so he tried to introduce himself to as many of the guests as he could before the food arrived. Finally, Gary noticed a man sitting alone with a clipboard and headed over to him. Taking a seat in the chair next to the man, Jason extended his hand to him with a smile. "Hi, I'm Gary Harris, one of the groomsmen." The man took Gary's hand and shook it. "I'm Preston Fulton, but everyone calls me Press." "Which bride or other groom are you here for?" asked Gary with a wider smile. "Actually, I'm here for you and for Jason," the man said, and then continued. "But I need to talk to you first, and then if you'll excuse me, I'd like to talk to you and Jason together." Gary found the man's request odd, and he wanted to know more before agreeing to anything. "I'm afraid you have an advantage over me," Gary said, feeling more than a little awkward. "What exactly do you need to talk to me about? For that matter, what do you need to talk to Jason and me about?" From his pocket, Press pulled an envelope. "I think this letter will explain most of my intentions. If, after reading it, you don't want to hear any more, then I'll talk to Jason alone." Gary opened the envelope and began to read. First of all, he was stunned by the fact that the letter had come from his father. But it was the contents of the envelope that shook Gary to the core. "Dear son, it pains me deeply that I have to send Mr. Fulton to deliver this message. To be blunt, Belinda cheated on you, and Mr. Fulton has proof. After you see the evidence, I ask you to take Mr. Fulton's advice. I have engaged the firm he works for because they offer much more than just proof of your future wife's infidelity. Please listen carefully to Mr. Fulton and take his word for it. My mom and I love you, and I am truly sorry you were betrayed in such an insulting way. If you need someone to talk to after this sad affair is over, I will always be there for you. Love. Dad." Gary reread the letter several times because he couldn't believe its contents. He loved Belinda with all his heart. She was everything he had ever dreamed of. She was beautiful, intelligent, witty, and loving. How could she cheat on him? His father had to be wrong. The letter may have been a forgery, but the signature was accurate. Gary just couldn't understand what his future wife was being accused of. "I don't believe what my father says," Gary said with growing anger. "If it were true, he would have told me so himself." "Let me introduce myself," Press said, pulling a business card out of his wallet. Gary picked it up and read it. In the center it said, "Me, Inc." At the bottom right it said, "Preston Fulton, Field Representative." The map didn't make sense, and Gary didn't try to hide his confusion or suspicion. "What the hell is this, Inc.?" Gary asked. "It stands for male equality," Mr. Fulton said simply. "What the hell is this?" Gary was now completely enraged. Over the past few decades, the women's liberation movement has had tremendous success in disenfranchising men. Our organization is dedicated to restoring equality between the sexes. In its present form, the National Organization for Women has done undeniable harm to young men and especially boys. "What? I've never heard anything like that," Gary objected. Besides, what does that have to do with Belinda cheating on me? As for your fiancé cheating on you, nothing but she feels entitled to do so because of the garbage spewed by the Now organization, Press said calmly. But our organization was founded to fight back against the unjust laws that are now in place and to protect young men and boys from the hatred directed at them by these women's organizations. Press paused for a moment to study Gary. Making sure that the young man was still watching him and not completely immersed in thoughts of his fiancée, Press continued. For example, most elementary school teachers are women, and study after study shows that these women consistently give boys lower grades than girls. A boy may not hear one good word about being a man his entire school life. Literally, we are producing generation after generation of wimps. When young men graduate from college, more and more of them are choosing to live at home with their parents. Fewer and fewer men are going to college. And of those who do enroll, even fewer go into academia. Me, Inc. is committed to reversing this trend. At that moment, Gary was close to melting. 10 minutes ago, he had been the happiest man in the world. Now he was on the verge of a nuclear explosion. He had to find out if it was true about Belinda. Okay, all that may be true, but where's the proof of Belinda's adultery? Gary, Press placed his hand on the young man's arm. Before I show you the evidence, I want you to remember your father's advice. Please listen carefully to what I'm about to offer and follow my instructions. After I show you the videotapes, you will want to meet your fiancé immediately. Naturally, you will want to punish everyone involved. However, by doing so, you'll deny yourself the opportunity for maximum revenge. And I want to emphasize that this is not just about revenge for revenge's sake. What I'm about to suggest should send a very strong message of treason. So, can I count on you to remain calm? Gary's heart began to beat much faster, and his hands were sweating. But finally, he nodded. Whether you decide to pounce on your fiancé tonight or not, I still want to talk to you and Jason. And while this conversation won't help you deal with the situation, it will help protect you both in the future. Gary nodded again. Satisfied, Mr. Fulton clicked the launch triangle on the screen and handed the tablet to Gary. A few seconds later, Gary saw Belinda making nice to some strange guy. There was no time or date on the video, so Gary brushed it off. He had slept with many women before his engagement to Belinda. He wouldn't blame her for her sexual activity before they were exclusive. Then another video started, and it angered Gary. It showed Belinda being entertained by an ex-boyfriend, and the date was stamped 2 days after they decided to only date each other. He brought it up because they decided to be exclusive for New Year's Eve. The video was dated January 3rd. However, Gary decided that if it was an isolated case of a relationship ending, he would ignore it. But the next 3 videos left no doubt that Belinda was a slut. They were made during the 6 months he and Belinda were engaged. Not only was Belinda being entertained by half a dozen different men in the videos, but some of them were his friends. The last video almost made Gary lose his temper and go on a rampage at the rehearsal party. It was a picture of Belinda and Gary's best man, Spencer Tolliver, having sex in Gary's apartment. And the audio recording was what almost made Gary erupt. I suppose these little get-togethers will end after your wedding, said Gary's best man. No way, Belinda giggled. I love Gary to bits, but I like you too. I'll find a way for us to get together. I feel kind of bad about having fun with old Gary, Spencer laughed, but I'd be crazy to give it all up. Press watched Gary looking like he was about to get sick. Taking a bottle out of his pocket, the field representative opened it and waved it in front of Gary's nose. Then he handed Gary the water bottle that was at his feet. Are you feeling better? Asked Mr. Fulton. Your reaction is quite typical of someone who has been taken by surprise. I'll explain in a minute how we're going to handle this situation. But take comfort in the fact that you found out about Belinda now and not 10 years from now when perhaps there will be children. When Gary had more or less pulled himself together, Press asked him to get Jason. Press advised Gary to tell his friend about Belinda. It would be best if Jason knew about it before the ceremony tomorrow. Press also told Gary that Jason wasn't facing the same problem, but they both needed to hear what he had to say. This information was important for the future of both of them. It took several minutes before Gary separated his friend from the groom. Finally, Gary insisted, saying that Jason needed to meet someone. On the way out, Gary whispered in Jason's ear. Jason stopped abruptly and said, "No way." But Gary assured him that it was true. The encounter was a little awkward, and at first Jason didn't want to stay. He only agreed when Gary explained in more detail what he had just learned about Belinda. At first, Jason, like Gary, didn't believe it. But instead of showing Jason the video, Mr. Fulton showed him 3 photographs that left no doubt about Belinda's betrayal. When both men were seated, Press set up a clipboard to record their conversation. He then went into detail about the organization he worked for. Later, Press would review his presentation to see if he had missed anything. Then, of course, he would send a copy to headquarters for review. Every such interview was criticized. Me, Inc. was constantly looking for better ways to grow its organization, protect its members, and disseminate information. Press told Gary again that he was sorry that his fiancée had made such a mess. He handed him a packet that had a detailed list of what he had to do at the ceremony. Press then handed each of the young men a book that described the mission of ME, Inc. and listed some of the problems the organization was facing and how they hoped to solve them. There was a list of recommendations that every married man should follow. The book was meant to reinforce the advice that Mr. Fulton gave to the young men. He also explained that their fathers had paid for lifetime memberships for their sons. Mr. Fulton stayed a few more minutes to make sure Gary didn't snap at his fiancée. He nodded approvingly when Gary told Belinda that he had stomach problems and was going to his parents' house. Staying at his parents' house had already been arranged. It was due to an old superstition that the groom was not to see his bride until after the wedding. Mr. Fulton also approved when Gary simply pecked Belinda on the cheek and left. If the bride suspected anything, she didn't show it in any way. She danced and drank for the rest of the evening. Some of the dancing caused confusion, but people tolerated Belinda because it was the night before her wedding. Taking his coat from the check room, Press headed for the exit. He had another appointment tonight. Besides, he had to be at the church tomorrow to oversee Gary's wedding. And the next day he had a meeting. Then, thankfully, he would be able to go home to his family. With his scarf wrapped around his neck and his winter coat on, Press stepped out into the cold Ohio night. The temperature hovered around 20 degrees, but the blowing wind made it seem much colder. Snowflakes were flying, and the overcast sky seemed to promise a blizzard. Press would be very thankful to be back in sunny South Florida soon. Press took Interstate 20 and headed into East Cleveland. Traffic was light at this time of day, so finding the main campus of the Cleveland Clinic was easy. And finding the right building was easy, as Cleveland Clinic is a huge facility that covers many square blocks. Fortunately, the parking lot was almost empty, so finding a parking spot, which was a whole lot of trouble during the day, was no problem. Upon entering the building, Press checked in at the main counter. His superiors had supplied him with the necessary paperwork to gain access without hassle. After taking a few wrong turns, he found the cafeteria and went in search of his next assignment. Thankfully, all of the hard work he had already completed. Most of the details were done in the office, but a few items still needed to be done on site. Pulling the photograph from his pocket, Press looked around the cafeteria. He spotted Ben Sharpen against the far wall, sitting alone at a table. Ben was 49 years old, but he looked at least 10 years older. He was about 5'10" tall, but weighed almost 240 pounds. His hair was a mixture of gray and blonde, but a predominant shade of gray. He looked like a battered man. His shoulders slumped and his skin was pale. Looking at him, Press wasn't sure Mr. Sharpen had ever smiled in his life. Mr. Sharpen, I'm Preston Fulton, Press introduced himself. You can call me Press if you want. I work for a company called Me, Inc. We work to help people like you. The man stood up and shook his hand. It's nice to meet you, but as I told you on the phone, you can't tell me anything about my ex-wife Connie that would shock me. And I'm sure there's nothing you can do to help me. The truth is, I don't give a damn what Connie does or who she does it with. As for my kids, they're not worth blowing up. I think I have some information that you will find very interesting, but before I begin, why don't you tell me about your marriage and divorce? Not much to tell, Ben shrugged. It was a shitty marriage. Connie and I got married right out of high school. The first 2 years of marriage weren't bad. I felt like we really loved each other. But then things started to change when she got a job at that brokerage firm. Her attitude changed, and I was already thinking about divorce. But then she got pregnant, and that's when I was at an impasse. Eventually, she was fired, and we moved. Things got better for about a year, but when she went back to work at the law firm, things went south again. Then she got pregnant again and quit her job. With 2 kids and a wife like Connie, it wasn't a good situation. but I stood my ground for the kids. However, I thought about divorce for a long time, but then Connie announced that she was pregnant again. What a waste of my life. Mr. Sharpen shook his head and took a sip from his coffee mug. Then he sighed. We were married for about 12 years, and then I caught her with a UPS man in our bed. I immediately filed for divorce. Stupid me didn't hire an expensive lawyer like she did. Of course, I had to pay her attorney fees since Connie was out of work. I got very little sex from Connie in the last years of our married life, but the courts screwed me big time. Tell me about the final divorce decree, asked Press. I became head of the X-ray department and started making decent money. After the judge got done with me, I was left with about what I was making when I started out. Connie got the house, and I had to pay the mortgage and property taxes. I had to pay Connie alimony and child support for each child. What really pisses me off is that I'm paying so Connie can stay home and have fun with her lovers. I'm sure they have a big laugh at my expense. So you can see why I'm not interested in anything Connie does. I've talked to several lawyers and they all say there's nothing I can do about it. Your case is one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice I've seen in recent memory, Press said sympathetically. I think action needs to be taken to change the situation. I appreciate your sentiments, but I only have 2 alimony payments to make and I'm free of those rotten children of mine. Connie has been turning them against me from day one. If any of those kids were burning, I wouldn't cross the street to piss on them to put out the fire. As for Connie, if she was burning, I would cross the street. But that would be to pour gasoline on her. So there's nothing I can do right now, but I appreciate that you care. You're one of the few people who took my side. I understand why you feel helpless, Press said, setting the briefcase on the table and opening it. But there are a few things you don't know that will change the game significantly. Like what? Now Ben was mildly curious. For starters, Mr. Sharpen, none of these 3 children are yours. Press pulled out the DNA tests and placed them on the table. That slutty bitch, yelled Ben, pounding his fist on the table. The cafeteria went quiet and all eyes turned to us. But after a few moments, everyone went back to their dishes. But then Press noticed that Ben seemed to shrink back into himself. In a quiet voice, he said, It's not much of a relief anyway because I'm almost done paying alimony. At least I won't have to feel guilty for hating those kids. No, Mr. Sharpen, your relief is just beginning, Press said with a smile. Let me explain. You may or may not have to pay your last 2 child support payments. We know who the fathers of all 3 children are. 2 of them work at a law firm and 1 works at a brokerage house. All 3 are married and are partners in their firms. We just filed papers to sue them for all the child support you paid for their children. They will be forced to pay you back tens of thousands of dollars. The wives of all 3 men will be informed of their infidelity. I don't know if their wives will divorce them or not, but there's a good chance they will. Ben sat stunned. Is it really true? Absolutely, and I'm not done yet. You still have a lot to learn, and will right any wrongs done to you. Why are you doing this for me? Ben asked with concern on his face. I can't afford to pay you anything. I'm barely making ends meet as it is. Calm down, Ben, Press said at once. This is being done pro bono. As I explained before, the company I work for is primarily concerned with correcting the injustices done to men. It is time that both men and women truly have equal rights. Wow, I didn't know there was such an organization, Ben offered. But how do you pay for everything you do? We use interest from our capital fund, explained Press simply. We attract new members all the time. New members pay a one-time initiation fee of $1,000. Then they pay an annual fee of $250. They also pledge to help if their expertise can be of assistance. Lifetime membership costs $100,000. All money raised goes into a capital fund. We use the interest to fund our projects. Currently, our capital fund is approaching $2 billion. We also have some major benefactors who fund our lobbying efforts and very generously contribute to our endowment. But I didn't pay you guys anything, Ben protested. And like I said, I don't have any money to spare. Again, Ben, calm down. It won't cost you anything. About 20 or 30 times a year, we take on cases pro bono. Your case is one of those. Me, Inc. takes care of all expenses. I don't know how to thank you, Ben said gratefully. I'm not done telling you about everything we're going to do on your behalf, but if you want to thank us, live well." Ben only nodded, then smiled for the first time that evening. "Now let me continue," Press began again. "Your ex-wife has not been honest with the court. She has a source of income. However, it is an illegal source. She sells drugs. Moreover, she was selling them while you were still married. She hid the money abroad, but we found out where and cleaned out her accounts. Tomorrow she'll find out all her money's gone. But that will be just the first bad news for her. We've arranged for the police to search your old house. Connie has recently decided to step up her game and has enough drugs on her person to be considered a major supplier. Not only that, we believe there is enough evidence to link the teenager's death to the drugs Connie sold him. We expect her to be sentenced to a minimum of 15 years. All 3 of her children will also be charged. All of them will also receive significant prison sentences. Oh yes, 4 of her past lovers will go down at the same time. Connie will be an old woman if she ever gets out of prison." Ben's eyes widened considerably as he tried to digest what he had heard. "Now let me tell you the most important thing of all. That brokerage house and that law firm that employed the people who got your wife pregnant are being sued for allowing their partners to take advantage of you and your wife. We expect them to quietly pay you a 7-figure settlement each. When that money arrives, you will be able, if you wish, to purchase a lifetime membership in ME Inc. However, since you are in a pro bono business, you are not required to do so." A smirk went from one of Ben's ears to the other. "I don't know if any of this is true, but just thinking about it makes my spirits rise. And certainly, if the money comes in as you say, I'll be sure to buy a lifetime membership." Ben had a few papers to sign, and then Press headed back to his room. He wanted to get a good night's sleep before the wedding tomorrow. The next day, the blizzard of the day before had subsided and the sun was shining brightly. Press was sure that the bride would be pleased. The temperature was still around 20 degrees. There was no wind, however, so the cold was quite bearable. The wedding was scheduled for 1:30 in the afternoon, so Press took his time, spending an hour looking through the paper. When he finished, Press rolled the paper into a ball and threw it on the floor. During his training, he'd been taught to detect media bias. There were at least 5 articles in this morning's paper supporting a woman's point of view or condemning a crime a man had allegedly committed against a woman. What annoyed the press was not that the man was likely guilty of what the article said, but that the article was put on the front page and gave the crime much more weight. This was typical of most newspapers, and the same bias was common to magazines, movies, television news, and TV shows. By 1:45, Press was sitting in the back row of the church on the groom's side. Once seated, he looked around for the videographer. Not finding one, Press stood up and started looking. If the person who was supposed to videotape the service wasn't there, Press would have to use his handheld camera. He didn't really want to do that because the quality of the footage wouldn't be very good. Finally, when Press went up to the balcony, he found the videographer sitting by the railing. When he went downstairs, Press saw that he had chosen a perfect place to shoot. Finding nothing else to do, he returned to his seat. At exactly 1:30, the organist, who was playing random pieces, suddenly stopped and began the wedding march. Gary, his best man, and the groom's friends had already gathered on one side of the altar. The bride began to walk slowly down the aisle under the arm of her father. About 10 minutes before the service began, the 2 white screens were slowly lowered to the side, but so that they were facing the congregation. When the bride and groom were finally together at the altar, the priest began. "Today is a glorious day when a man and a woman will vow to each other in holy matrimony. It is the beginning of a lifetime of loving, working, and helping each other become more than they would have been apart." Gary Lewis Harris, do you take Belinda Marie Cummings to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, in sickness and in health, in wealth and in poverty, leaving all others until death do you part? Gary didn't say anything. For several long seconds, he just stood there staring at Belinda. The assembled guests began to murmur because of the delay in answering. Then Gary turned to the people in the pews and said in a loud voice, "No, I will not take that cheating whore as my wife." Gary pressed a button on the remote, and immediately footage of Belinda being entertained appeared on the screens. Pandemonium broke out as Belinda and her mother screamed. Some people got up and left the church as quickly as possible. Press watched the expression on Spencer's face, which had turned 6 shades paler. At that moment, Gary moved toward Spencer. Gary, me, the best man whispered. He didn't get a chance to say anything because Gary hit him with his right. The blow struck Spencer on the bridge of his nose, and everyone in the church heard the bone break. Spencer flew backward and blood rushed from everywhere. Some of it got on Gary, but the priest was hurt too, as was the front of Belinda's wedding dress. At that moment, Belinda collapsed to the floor and broke into hysterical sobs, while her mother tried to comfort her. Belinda's father stood over the two women, red-faced. He looked alternately at the screen and at his daughter, and there was an expression of absolute disgust on his face. Finally, he growled, "Belinda, don't come back to our house!" As this drama unfolded, the groom's friends, except Jason, began to move, but they didn't know what to do. Jason stepped toward them, raising his hand. "That thing on the floor is a piece of shit," Jason said threateningly. "If you want to defend it, you're no friends of Gary's or mine." The four groomsmen looked at Jason and then at the screen. They all shook their heads, and one of them said, "I want nothing to do with that asshole. What a piece of shit." Jason walked over to the fallen Spencer and helped him up. "Listen, Spencer," Jason said in a loud voice with disgust. "You know you're a piece of shit, and everyone here now knows you're a piece of shit. We've been friends all our lives, and this is what you did? Not only were you supposed to be Gary's best friend, you're also an ADA. How do you think your boss is going to react when he gets that copy on his desk on Monday? And I think the copy that gets sent to the Bar Association is going to get you in a lot of trouble. So why don't you do everybody a favor and get the hell out of here? Oh, and lose our phone numbers." Spencer crabbed his way away from Jason and disappeared through a door at the back of the church. Meanwhile, Gary took out the package Mr. Fulton had given him the night before and hid it behind the column to the right of the altar. From it, he took out pictures of Belinda with various men and began handing them out. The groomsmen were the first to get the pictures, then Gary settled on Belinda and her mother. "Here are some pictures to help you remember this special day," Gary said, dropping a dozen into Belinda's lap. She raised a pained look at him. "I'm so sorry, Gary." "I really love you." Gary just shook his head and grinned. "Let me see if I'm understanding this correctly. You're expressing your love for me by having fun with Spencer. You really are a slut, Belinda. You desperately need help. But luckily, that's not my problem. Good luck with the rest of your miserable life." "Please, Gary, give me another chance," she shouted after him. Over his shoulder, he replied, "No way." Gary walked down the aisle, tossing the pictures onto the pews. Then his father caught up with him and put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Come on, Gary, I think we should all go. The reception is already paid for. I think we should at least get something to eat for our trouble." Looking at his father's sad smile, Gary replied, "Give me a second, Dad. There is one other person I want to be sure to show these pictures to." Gary headed toward the solidly built older man with gray hair who was Belinda's boss. He was the owner of a well-known financial planning firm. It was where Belinda had worked for the past 2 years. "Mr. Turner, I'm Gary Harris," Gary addressed Belinda's boss. "You probably don't remember me, but you and I met at your company's Christmas party." "Yes, Gary, I remember you," Mr. Turner said, rising and taking his wife's hand to help her up. "I'm terribly sorry about the way things turned out." "I'd like to give you these pictures." Gary held out half a dozen snapshots. "There's no need for that, Gary. I've seen enough." "Oh, these pictures aren't for you, Mr. Turner," Gary said, holding them out to Mrs. Turner. "These pictures are for Mrs. Turner. They are pictures of you and Belinda. You spread her out on your desk and made a good deal of fun of her. I hope you enjoy these pictures, Mrs. Turner, as much as your husband and Belinda enjoyed this moment." Gary then turned to his father. "I'm ready to go now, Dad." Press smiled as he recorded this exchange. After consulting with the videographer and making sure he knew where to send a copy of the recording, Press headed back to his room. He needed to write up his report and review the videotape he had made of his conversation with Gary and Jason. The report was pretty straightforward. Press went over it twice to make sure he had included everything and hadn't messed anything up. Press then pulled out his clipboard and reviewed the conversation with Gary and Jason. He kept a checklist next to him to mark off each item as it was explained. The first thing he talked about was the mission of Me Inc. It was very simple, to ensure that all men are treated equally under the law and to help Me Inc. members who are being cheated on by women or men. Those present watched and listened as he explained that current divorce laws treat men worse than second-class citizens. Even if husband and wife are equally good parents, the courts almost always award primary custody to the woman. Not only that, if the woman did not work, she is almost always awarded alimony. There was no opposition to alimony per se by ME Inc. What they did oppose was unlimited alimony, which thankfully has not been allowed in many states. At some point, a woman should be forced to get a job. And the sooner the better. Also, Maine Inc. recommended that instead of placing children with only one parent and allowing limited access to the non-custodial parent, a different arrangement be worked out. This new custody plan, if implemented, provided that the parents would change residences every 2 weeks. The children would not have to move, and both parents would get significantly more time with the children. The next part, according to press, was especially important for men who are not married but are in a relationship with a woman. He explained to them as emphatically as possible that they should always use some form of contraception. He warned them never to believe women who said they were on the pill or unable to conceive. Press spent quite a bit of time on this issue because if a man isn't careful, the woman he has sex with could get pregnant. And since the feminist movement planted the belief that a woman had complete control over whether or not she would have a child, this gave her complete reproductive control to the detriment of men. Although Me Inc. did not object to women deciding for themselves whether or not to have an abortion, they did object to women refusing to accept economic responsibility if they chose to keep the child, despite the objections of the man. The woman had the right to decide to terminate the pregnancy, but the man had no say if she decided to keep the child. The courts regularly forced the man to pay child support. Me Inc. believed this was a travesty of justice. The telephone in the room startled and worried Press. He rarely got a call when he was in the field. Press always called his wife every night, and if she called, it meant it was something urgent. Once in a while, the office called. Pressing pause on his tablet, Press picked up the phone. "Hey, Turner, something's happened," said Press boss James Baker. "I'm very sorry, but you're going to have to extend your stay here for another day." "Oh, what's going on?" "We have another project scheduled for the next day in Akron, and the designated representative on site has the flu. Everything is already set up. You'll just need to be present for the taping. Make sure you'll be allowed to film everything. I need more than just an audio recording of the meeting. The usual bonus for the extra day has already been approved and will be included in your next paycheck. I've got my camera charging right now, so no problem. And I never turn down extra money," Press grinned. "But you know me, I'd just as soon spend an extra day. That's how much I believe in what we do. I always appreciate your attitude. I will email you all the details of the new assignment. We have rebooked you on a later flight, so don't worry about that. Again, I apologize for tearing you away from your family. Hopefully, your flight will be able to leave before the big snowstorm hits. 15 to 20 inches of snow is predicted to fall." After the call, Press waited for the letter to load before opening it. It turned out to be an interesting case of a wife who dreamed of becoming a movie star. Her husband was a very successful screenwriter in film and television. He had just finished his latest script for a very successful television series that had been running for 5 years. Even though they wanted him to stay, he had other things to do. During the 5 years of their marriage, his wife, without realizing it herself, had had numerous affairs. All of them were with people in the industry who the wife thought could advance her career. She was now dating one of Hollywood's biggest stars, Kirk Southern. He had promised to cast her in his next 3 movies. Press looked into all the logistics of this project to make sure everything was provided for. This was not his responsibility, but he did it regardless of how involved he was in the project. This project was well planned and perfectly executed. He then looked through his email and found information about the new flight. Finally, he turned his attention back to the video. Press has always found the men's reaction to one of the ME Inc. presentations interesting. This was the case with both Gary and Jason. But it was the next item that Press shared that elicited the most response. Press addressed the topic of DNA testing. This was one of the biggest lobbying efforts of Me Inc. They hoped that every state would pass a law that would require DNA testing of all newborns. Too few fathers do DNA testing of their children when they are born. If the new law were passed, it would allow paternity to be established right away. It would also allow potential health problems in newborns to be identified. The problem with establishing paternity for men was that if it was not established within a fairly short period of time, the father could find himself stranded and paying for children that were not his. In many states, courts ruled that men only had a short period of time to prove that they were not fathers. After that, cuckolded men had to pay for the children. Even if they knew who the real father was and could prove it, there was no guarantee that the courts would make natural fathers pay. If the new law had been passed, it would have allowed a man to stop paying at any time for children who were proven not to be his. In the present situation, the cheating wife was rewarded, and the innocent husband was punished. Press continued to watch his presentation on his tablet, noting each point as it was discussed. However, he paused the video when he reached one particular section. It was an issue he had never considered in his first marriage. It was the issue of his wife's refusal to have sex. His first wife wanted sex all the time and, as it turned out, wasn't too picky about who she had sex with. While money was still the #1 issue causing discord in marriages, sex was at the top of the list. The laws had changed in the last 30 or 40 years, and now a husband could not force his wife to have sex with him. Press was in favor of this, but here the question arose: why get married? Press couldn't imagine anything more humiliating than a husband wanting to have sex with his wife and her refusing him for no good reason. To address this problem, Maine Incorporated recommended that all men insist on a prenuptial agreement. It was strongly recommended that they sign a prenuptial agreement before marriage. This was recommended regardless of whether or not they had property. Of course, this agreement prescribed the division of property in case of divorce, but it went much further. It also contained a clause that penalized one spouse if it was proven that he or she had cheated. Instead of a 50-50 split, it would be split 70-30, with the lion's share going to the spouse who did not cheat. It was also recommended that the agreement include a clause that at least one day a week be set aside for sex. This way, the husband did not have to worry about being rejected. It also stipulated that if either party refused to honor the terms, it was grounds for an 80-20 divorce with property division. Of course, the spouse who refused to have sex would only get 20% of the property. Despite some doubts about the philosophy of ME Inc., the press supported the organization 100%. He himself participated in pro bono assistance when his cheating first wife tried to out him. Press knew that without their help, he would have had to live an even worse life than he had with Ben. The next day, Press was up early because he had an appointment at breakfast with a rare assignment. Today, he was to meet with Janet Arnold. Yes, he was to meet with a woman. It didn't happen often, but when the situation did, Maine Inc. was fully prepared for action. Press saw a woman sitting in one of the back booths. Her 2 children were sitting on the inside of the bench next to their mother. The boy, who Press thought was about 7, was sitting by the window, and the girl, who looked to be about 5, was sitting next to her mother. Both had sand-colored hair and were coloring crayons on their placemats. They were both wearing a variety of clothes that protected them from the cold. They looked content for the moment, but glanced at their mother from time to time to make sure she was still around. Janet had dirty blonde hair that she was trying to put in a semblance of order. She wore no makeup and looked haggard. Once upon a time, Press thought, Janet must have been quite beautiful. But now she was a little overweight, and her eyes seemed dull. And even from across the room, it was obvious that Mrs. Arnold was at least 6 months pregnant. But Press took comfort in the fact that he was to relieve some of her suffering. When Press was first sent on a case like this, it really surprised him. So much so that he questioned why he was helping a woman. He thought it was the job of Me Inc., was to help men. Mr. Wagner, a senior vice president, heard the question and immediately stepped in to clear the air for the new company representative. Mr. Fulton, he said cheerfully, I think you should reread your textbook. We strive for true equality between the sexes, not the one-sided policies that feminists preach. It's true that we primarily help men, but if one of our members is cheating on his spouse, we'll help the woman if we can. The longer Press worked for the organization, the more he appreciated Me Inc. It was not trying to bring back the old days when women were effectively the property of their husbands. On the contrary, Maine Inc. wanted the laws to be fair without favoring one sex over the other. The organization wanted to restore the sanctity of marriage and punish as many cheaters as possible. According to the organization, if cheaters were assured that they would pay a heavy price for their infidelity, they might think twice before having an affair. Mrs. Arnold, thank you for meeting me, Press said, lowering himself into the booth across from her. I hope you don't mind, Mr. Fulton, she asked, nervously looking back at her children. But my mother hasn't been able to watch the kids. Not at all, he said with a smile, turning to the 2 children. I hope you're hungry because I hear the pancakes here are amazing. They put whipped cream and sprinkles on them. At the mention of food, both children raised their heads. Press felt a slight pain in his heart. He could see that they were hungry. The thought of his children starving made him sad. You don't have to do that, Mr. Fulton, Janet protested. You told me you found my husband's small account, and you know how I can access the money. Ever since Thad left us, money has been tight. If you tell me how to do that, we'll leave you. Nonsense, Press said, beckoning to the waitress. In fact, I have many things to share with you, and I'd like to talk to you about some of them in private. But right now, I think we should order breakfast, and I'll tell you everything I think you need to know. It was obvious Janet didn't want to impose, but Press wasn't going to back down. Finally, after looking at the pleading eyes of her children, she gave in. With Janet's approval, Press ordered pancakes with whipped cream and sprinkles for the kids. He also ordered bacon, hash browns, and a glass of chocolate milk for each child. Janet ordered scrambled eggs, toast and coffee, and Press ordered a Western omelet and coffee. After coffee and chocolate milk were served, Janet introduced her two children. The boy was named Michael and his sister was named Terry, which was Teresa's nickname. They were actually 7 and 5 years old. In very simple terms, Janet explained that her husband Simon had run off with his secretary Tammy. He left behind a bunch of bills, kids, and no money. Simon had disappeared, and Janet had no idea where he was. When the food had been delivered and the children were concentrating on devouring their pancakes, Press began. I assume you knew your husband had been married before? Janet nodded. He told me she was a witch and tried to give him the purge. Exactly, Press said, pulling a folder out of his briefcase. They were only married for 2 years, but his first wife, Mary, found out all his passwords and stole all his money. Then she even planted drugs in his car and house. Your husband was facing years in prison until we intervened. I don't understand, Janet said, setting her fork aside. Who do you represent and how did you help Simon? I guess the easiest thing to say is that we're like an insurance company and your husband bought a policy to protect himself from being cheated. And Mary didn't turn out to be as smart as she thought she was. For one thing, she left her fingerprints on one bag of drugs. We also arrested her supplier and he turned her in. Then we found out where Simon's money had been transferred to and recovered it. This explanation seemed to satisfy Janet, and she went back to eating. When I first called you, Press said, opening the folder, I had just begun my investigation. Normally, I wouldn't have contacted you so soon, but I knew how desperate you were for money. In any case, since we last spoke, I've managed to uncover a lot more of your husband's assets. He's really doing quite well for himself. Did you know that? Janet shook her head. Thad took care of the money. I took care of the kids in the house. So far, I have determined that he absconded with about $2 million worth of liquid assets, Press explained. In addition, he has partnership interest in 3 businesses where he is a silent partner. He receives about $100,000 a year in income from these 3 businesses. Mrs. Arnold, there is every reason to believe that you are entitled to your husband's 1/2 interest in these partnerships. Janet sat in her seat with her mouth open. After thinking for a moment, she leaned forward and said with deep sadness in her eyes, That may be true, but I don't have the money to fight my husband. I can't even afford a divorce lawyer, so there's nothing I could do. Mrs. Arnold, I don't want you to worry about this anymore, Press said, patting her hand. We've arranged for an excellent attorney to handle your case. He'll be contacting you later today. As for paying for his services, we already have a court order that your husband will be responsible for his bills. In addition, we have located your husband. He went to Costa Rica with his girlfriend, but he has been served with divorce papers and is in custody pending extradition. All of his assets are now frozen, except for the modest amounts that the court has ordered to be paid to you and Tad for living expenses. Tears streamed down Mrs. Arnold's face, and she began to tremble petulantly. This isn't a cruel joke, is it? I assure you that everything I have told you is true, and I have put all the documents to back up my words in this envelope, which you can take with you and read later. Before you leave, I will give you access to the first account. You can transfer the money or just withdraw it. But right now, I'd like to talk to you in private. Do you mind if we sit at the empty table over there? You can watch your children, but they won't hear what I say next. Janet gave Press a strange look, but after telling the children to behave, she moved to a nearby table. They were still fully engrossed in their pancakes and chocolate milk. As soon as Janet was seated, Press began discussing the sensitive part. Your husband, as it turns out, is not a very nice man. But I suppose you've already guessed that. I don't know when he turned into the scoundrel he is now, but he made a very bad mistake. There is a clause in our insurance policies that spells out the penalties if he breaks any of the rules. Not cheating on his wife is the very first rule. A look of confusion appeared on Janet's face. Fines? What kind of fines? I don't understand. Well, most of the wealth your husband will have left after you get your fair share will go to pay his fines to me, Inc. He won't go bankrupt, but his standard of living will drop significantly after he gets out of prison. Prison! Janet said louder than she wanted to. What's he going to jail for? He will be convicted of tax evasion and currency violations. I can't tell you how much time he'll get, but I'm sure he'll spend at least 6 months in jail. And I'm sure you don't care about his secretary, Tammy. But for your information, she's stuck in Costa Rica with no money. All the research I've done convinces me that she's nothing more than a gold digger. It's going to be very difficult for her to get back to the United States, since Thad put their passports in a safe deposit box, and Tammy doesn't have access to them. A smile lit up Janet's face, and then she started laughing. After getting Janet to sign some legal documents, Press said, standing up, "Well, I've got to go." But before he put on his winter coat, he pulled an envelope from his pocket. Here's $500. I want you and the kids to buy some proper winter clothes. And then I want you to have a wonderful life. After Press said goodbye to the children, Janet kissed him on the cheek. I really don't know what's going on. But I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Press paid the bill on the way out and headed to Akron. It was there that an additional project was to be realized. The next day, Press went to a conference room in the office of Moreland, Connor, and Stiles. These attorneys represented Beverly Bracken in her divorce proceedings. Gloria Connor was the attorney who handled the filings and negotiations. This firm had a reputation for almost always winning. In divorces, they were particularly cruel to the spouses. But today was not one of those days. In fact, it was the worst loss in the firm's history. Paul Bracken was represented by a rather unassuming middle-aged man, Elliot Chalmers. He looked more like a poor British civil servant than a lawyer. Paul, Elliot, and Press sat on one side of the table, with Paul sitting between the other two men. On the other side sat Mrs. Bracken, Gloria Connor, 4 paralegals, a court stenographer, and a secretary who was just putting her elaborate notary seal. Press studied both Paul and Beverly. Paul was certainly better looking than the average guy with black hair and an attractive personality. He entertained Press and Elliot with stories about working in Hollywood. Beverly was a strikingly beautiful woman. Her blonde hair, blue eyes, and stunning figure caused instant awe. But after your first reaction, you would begin to realize that there was something off about her. Perhaps it was her smile, which never seemed to reach her eyes. She just didn't seem quite sincere. Regardless, Beverly was stunning, and it was obvious why Paul had married her. Before we begin, Press stood up and placed his camera bag on the table. I'd like to set up my camera to record this meeting. That's impossible, Gloria said with a wave of her hand. We don't allow filming in our offices unless it's a court deposition. So I'm sorry you're going to have to put the camera away. Press looked at Elliot, who immediately spoke up. If we can't get this production off the ground, then we're out. And the deal we agreed to is off. We'll have to start from scratch. You can't do that, Beverly said anxiously. At that moment, Kirk Southern poked his head in, nodded to everyone, and looked at Beverly. I just wanted to let you know I'm here. Press looked around the women in the room, and everyone, even Gloria, had a dreamy expression on their faces. He grinned to himself. Beverly looked pleadingly at Gloria, who finally nodded her head. Okay, Mr. Fulton, you can set up your camera, Gloria said, snorting irritably. I think we can make an exception. Once the camera was set up and working, they began discussing the details of the divorce. The house was to be sold and the proceeds divided. But Press knew that because of the current real estate market situation, he had very little equity. The money was also to be split 50-50ths. There wasn't much, however, because Paul was mostly writing, and they were living on royalties from the last television series he created. As for the royalties, Paul agreed to give them to Beverly instead of alimony. Beverly, just so we're clear, Paul interrupted Gloria. You get royalties from the Gobbler Twins television series. Since I'm giving you all rights to it, you waive any claim to my stamp or comic book collection. In addition, you relinquish any rights to any work I have done or will do in the future. I don't need your stupid comic books, Beverly said dismissively. I have everything I want. One of the last items was a child support clause for Sarah Bracken, who was almost a year old. Gloria objected to the wording, which stated that Paul would pay $1,500 a month to support any children he and Beverly had. I'd rather Sarah be named directly, Gloria insisted. Look, Paul said angrily, I don't want anything more to do with that bitch who will soon be my ex-wife. She's a slut who will spread her legs for anyone. I know this is true because Beverly had sex with me right before she served the divorce papers. For all I know, she has a bun in the oven right now. I don't want to go back and do it again. The agreement still stands unless you want to renegotiate everything. Mr. Bracken, I will not tolerate that kind of profanity. Gloria's face flashed with anger. And I think the wording in this agreement needs to be changed. I'll go along with the wording as written, Beverly immediately stated. Gloria tried to talk her out of it, but it was clear that Beverly wanted to finalize the divorce. Finally, they checked the last item, and Paul and Beverly signed the document. Then the witnesses signed, and finally the notary stamped it. Then one copy was given to Beverly, one to Paul, and each lawyer kept a copy. All set? Asked Paul. When everyone nodded, he stood up and announced loudly, Thank God it's over and I'm not married to that damn whore. Beverly and Gloria flinched at that expression. But it was Gloria who spoke. I've already told you that I won't tolerate that kind of expression. I think you'd better leave before the guard throws you out. Before Paul could answer, the door opened and Kirk walked in. Beverly walked around the table and kissed him. Then she put her arms around his waist and grinned at her ex-husband. But, to the surprise of most in the room, Kirk extended his hand to Paul. Hey Paul, how's it going? I'm doing great, Kirk, Paul squeezed the movie star's hand. I'm no longer married to that cheating whore who's hugging you. I'd heard she had such a reputation in Hollywood, but I didn't believe it, Kirk said, removing Beverly's hand from his waist and taking her hand. But apparently you're right. Still, I won the bet. Yes, it was, Paul laughed. But it was worth it. What are you two talking about? Beverly asked in confusion. Do you two know each other? Kirk smiled at her and released her hand. I've known Paul since college. What's the bet? Paul and Kirk laughed together. Now Gloria and her assistants were as confused as Beverly. Well, Beverly dear, Paul said with a smirk. I bet Kirk that he wouldn't succeed in seducing my faithful, loving wife. I lost. But Kirk, you said you loved me, Beverly said with tears in her eyes. You said you'd marry me as soon as I was divorced. Beverly, when you married Paul, you promised to leave everyone else behind, Kirk said, shaking his head and smirking. When I found out about the other men you slept with after the wedding, that was the deciding factor. Now Beverly broke into real sobs. It took 5 minutes before Gloria was able to calm her client. When Beverly had more or less calmed down, Paul sat down next to her. Beverly, I'm a little slow, but I really thought you loved me, he said, taking her hand. But I have to admit that you were good. I didn't know anything until a year later. I was so angry I wanted to divorce you immediately. Then I thought about Sarah and decided I had to be patient. But when I took a DNA test and found out she wasn't mine, I decided you needed to be taught a lesson. Beverly turned white when Paul mentioned the DNA test. That's why you insisted on that language, Gloria said through clenched teeth. You set us up. The whole thing was an embarrassment. It was done to deceive my client. I want the entire divorce petition canceled. Good luck to you, counselor, Elliot said with a strained smile. My client wasn't trying to trick anyone. According to your client, she got everything she wanted. If any fraud was committed here, your client did it by trying to pass her child off as Mr. Bracken's child. If you think you have a case, try your best. As far as I'm concerned, I like the evidence we have in this chamber. There was silence in the room, only Beverly sobbing. Then Paul spoke. Beverly, look at me. His ex-wife looked up. Paul sighed. I'm going to be honest with you. I thought that if I humiliated you, it would give me pleasure. But it didn't. I loved you with all my heart, and even after I learned of your betrayal, some part of me still loved you. Kirk is right about your reputation. Every producer and every director knows you'd spread your legs to get a part. I guess I was the only one who didn't know your true character. Beverly was panting, and Press couldn't help but notice her breasts rising and falling with each breath. As Press watched, it became obvious that Paul still had feelings for Beverly. Remember the day you got a part in my show, The Gobbler Twins? Beverly nodded. I was so happy that all my hard work had finally paid off. And you didn't lift a finger to help me. That's where you're wrong, Paul said, shaking his head. It's true that I told you that you had to do it yourself. But as I've watched you try and try again, and fail, I did help you. I never told you that I interceded on your behalf for the part you got. You're lying, Beverly snapped back. I earned that part myself. That's what I wanted you to believe. The truth is, I had to make a deal with the studio to get you this role. I had to limit the number of years I would receive royalties. That's why they will end in about 2.5 years. Beverly's face showed shock. Gloria's face turned bright red as she suddenly realized her mistake. She didn't inquire about the status of the royalties, only made sure they were paid. Gloria felt a crushing humiliation. However, that humiliation paled in comparison to what Beverly felt. The thing she was most proud of had only come about because of her husband's sacrifice. Beverly began to sob again because deep down, she seemed to accept the truth. I also want you to know that I will not abandon Sarah, Paul said affectionately. She's not my daughter, but I have feelings for her. I have instructed Mr. Chalmers to set up a trust fund for her. So far, I have invested $200,000 in it. I intend to increase this amount until it reaches $500,000 if I have the opportunity. The interest from this trust will be used for Sarah's care. Beverly, you will never have any control over this money. You will only be allowed to present bills, which will be audited to pay for Sarah's maintenance. When Sarah turns 25, the trust will be transferred to her. As for you, I urge you to keep the money coming in from the serials. You're going to need it. The truth is, Beverly, you're not a very good actress. However, with your reputation, you can probably get small roles until your looks start to fade. I'd advise you to choose another career, but if you don't mind spreading your legs to get roles, go ahead. A look of pure hatred appeared on Beverly's face. Paul seemed to have hit a nerve. As angry as she was, Beverly said nothing. Instead, she turned to Kirk for comfort. Paul exhaled and shook his head sadly. In all my life, Beverly, I don't believe you've ever truly loved anyone but yourself. But one day you will find love, and I hope you won't be betrayed like I was. Paul paused and looked at Kirk, and then back at Beverly. However, I fear that today is the day you will know that pain, and if that is the case, you have my sympathy. Slowly, Paul rose to his feet. Beverly, this is the last time we're talking. If you have anything to report to me, do it through Elliot. Take care of Sarah or the wrath of God will come upon you. Paul looked around the room, then shook hands with Elliot and the president. After patting Kirk on the shoulder, they left together. Beverly put her head down on the table and sobbed pitifully. Press quickly gathered his equipment, picked up his car, and headed for the airport. His flight was the last one before the airport closed due to the impending snowstorm. A year later, Preston Turner settled into the chair across from his boss, James Baker. It was time for the annual review. Press knew that all of his cases were periodically reviewed as soon as he filed them. But during the annual review, his boss looked at cases that Press felt should have been closed. Today, Press hoped to close 3 cases from Cleveland and 1 from Akron. After reading Press's highly commended annual review, the 2 men moved to review the cases to determine if they should be closed. Analyze this project with Gary and Jason. Tell me why you think they should be shut down, Mr. Baker ordered the president. Gary Harris and Jason Witten, Press read from his folder. If you don't remember, the 2 were supposed to be married in a few days, but we discovered that Gary's fiancée is a serial cheater. Gary completely humiliated Belinda at a church service and walked out. Yes, I remember that video, Mr. Baker nodded. I almost felt sorry for her. Apparently, she really loved Gary. But anyway, how is she feeling? After her cheating was discovered, Belinda left Cleveland. She eventually ended up in Las Vegas, where she works as a waitress and part-time dealer. She keeps in touch with her mother, but her father refuses to communicate with her. After her failed marriage, Belinda continues to date several men. I believe that she is incapable of maintaining fidelity. Unfortunately for her, however, Belinda seems to still have a memory of Gary, as she writes to him periodically. He has apparently forgiven her, as he occasionally responds to her letters. However, there is absolutely no chance of reconciliation in the future. Gary is actually dating a certain Linda Chaucer quite seriously. If my sources are correct, he intends to propose to her within the next 2 months. What about the best man? How was he treated? Actually, we didn't have to do anything. The district attorney fired him, and the Bar Association suspended his license for 5 years. He lost all his friends and left town shortly after the marriage fiasco. And Belinda's boss? His wife ripped him off in the divorce. He is by no means poor, but he has lost half of everything, and his 3 children do not speak to him. What about the other guy, Jason Witten? He married his fiancée, Melissa, and from the looks of it, they are very happy. Besides, Melissa signed a prenup without any objections. Oh, and they're expecting their first child any day now. Mr. Baker smiled. I approve of the closing of both these cases. Now tell me about the Ben Sharpen case. As we had hoped, Ben was able to sue and get the birth fathers to pay him back the child support he was paying for their children. However, Ben was able to accomplish much more than just getting his child support money back. As you know, we found the money that his ex-wife was hiding overseas in the drug trade. After taking the amount of alimony Ben was paying her and $300,000 for his pain and suffering, we told the IRS where the rest of the money was. The lawsuits against the law firm and the finance house were quite successful. After deducting legal fees, Ben received almost $2 million. All 3 birth fathers were divorced from their wives. 2 attorneys got their wives to sign prenuptial agreements, but those were rejected. Their husbands did not make sure that the individual attorneys representing their wives reviewed the agreements. All 3 received large sums in the divorce. As for Ben, he left the Cleveland clinic and opened several medical clinics of his own. In addition, he got a girlfriend. Linda Crawford used to be a nurse at the Cleveland clinic and now works for Ben at one of his clinics. Ben also joined a gym and has lost 40 pounds so far. What about his ex-wife and her children? Mr. Baker pressed. Mrs. Sharpen was convicted of several charges, including drug dealing and income tax evasion. The heroin she sold was proven to have caused the death of a teenager. She was sentenced to terms ranging from 20 years to life. Her children received prison terms ranging from 5 to 7 years. Her 4 most recent lovers also received prison sentences, but I did not inquire into their length because they were not part of this project. Great job. I approve of closing this one as well. The Janet Arnold case gave me particular pleasure, Press continued, without waiting for a response. I am particularly pleased with the result. Mrs. Arnold and her children were so spoiled by one of our members that I was ashamed. I remember the case, Mr. Baker admitted. It was discussed at length at several executive meetings. Do you think it can be closed now? Yes, sir. The final judgments are in, and Mrs. Arnold has received half of the property we were able to find. At first I thought there was more money somewhere. But from the state of Mr. Arnold's affairs, I'm sure we got everything. And how is good old Mr. Arnold? After Mrs. Arnold got her share, we paid Mr. Arnold's taxes with interest. As you know, we never pay interest to the government because it can take them 3 years or more to determine that they are owed additional taxes. Because of the government's incompetence, we don't believe they are entitled to interest. Nevertheless, when it was over, Mr. Arnold was left with less than $200,000. Since this amount exceeds the maximum amount allowed to be retained for breach of contract, I was prepared to proceed with the case. However, one of his partnership investments went bad, and he lost all but about $30,000. He is now selling used cars. What about the other 2 partnerships? Even receiving half of his share of the income would exceed the maximum allowed. To cover his part of the losses from the failed partnership, he had to sell his interest in the other 2. However, we were able to get Mrs. Arnold's claim satisfied before he sold his shares. She is now receiving the income that is rightfully hers. And here's another thing, Press smiled, pulling out a sheet of paper. There seems to have been a mix-up in the paperwork for the extradition warrant. Mr. Arnold had to spend 3 months in a Costa Rican prison. He went in there a little overweight and came out of there skinny. Apparently, the marshals were pissed because they had never seen a man so happy to be back in a U.S. prison. Just out of idle curiosity, Prece's boss asked, what happened to the woman Mr. Arnold ran off with? Ah, Tammy, Prece smiled. It took her almost 2 months to return to the United States. After a life of poverty in Costa Rica, I dare say she has a new appreciation for America. Anyway, because of her behavior with her previous boss, she had a hard time finding a new job. She eventually landed a position as an administrative assistant. As far as I can tell, she has not returned to her gold digger image. Nevertheless, she will be monitored, and if she returns, and it is with one of our members, we will take action. I want to be cautious, said Mr. Baker, studying the report. Perhaps we'll leave this case open for a while longer to see what Tammy will do and to see if Mr. Arnold has any more money stashed away. Now for the last case, Mr. Paul Bracken. I know what it was, but I'd like you to familiarize yourself with its results. The divorce was contested, but the court dismissed it. Mr. Bracken is now producing a new television series called Runaway Husbands. He made a deal with the studio that owns the series. Since its release, it has been in the top 10. It's already been renewed for 2 years. And the funny thing about this show is that the role of the narrator, in my opinion, would be perfect for Paul's ex-wife Beverly. I can't help but believe he wrote the show with her in mind. And whether Mr. Southern was able to escape Beverly's clutches, Mr. Baker grinned. Their relationship ended that day. And I believe that Mr. Bracken was right when he said that Beverly would fall in love and perhaps one day be betrayed. From my observations, Beverly did love Kirk and was crushed when he left her. She didn't see him for 6 months after that and only dated him sporadically. Beverly now works as a real estate agent, and as far as we can tell, she's not currently sleeping with anyone. It seems that Beverly spends most of her non-working time with her daughter Sarah. She's turning out to be a much better mother than I would have guessed. Oh yeah, she also performs occasionally at the local community theater. It's not exactly your project, but I figured since you're coming to me, I'd take a look at it. Based on the results, I'm ready to shut it down. Finishing his review, Prece began to rise. If you have nothing else, I'll get back to work. Yes, I have another matter I want to discuss with you. Mr. Baker waved at Prece, and he returned to his chair. What could it be, sir? As you know, we recently crossed the 2 million mark, and our growth is faster than expected. We need more and more representatives in the field, and we are in great need of qualified regional supervisors. I just received authorization this morning, and you are being promoted to one of those supervisory positions. Congratulations! Prece was stunned, but still managed to thank Mr. Baker. You deserve it, President. Your work has been exemplary. You will begin work on Monday. However, I want to warn you that 3 or 4 of the projects your new team is working on are going very badly right now. I'm sure you'll be able to fix them. Good luck. They shook hands and Prece, beaming, walked out of his boss's office. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.